Hello, comrades. Today I would like to talk about dialectical materialism. The previous video I made was I was kind of just thinking out loud about some aspects of dialectical materialism, and I mentioned that I'm going to make a refutation of a particular Trotskyist who has basically made it their life mission to disprove Marxist dialectics. So that will be coming up next, I think. But before I did that, I kind of wanted to make a video explaining what exactly dialectics is. So, what is dialectical materialism? Well, I will begin by reading a definition of what it is from Stalin's Historical and Dialectical Materialism, which is considered one of his more important theoretical works. It's not really developing any new theory, it's more just summing up Leninism, which is mostly what his theoretical works do. Dialectical materialism is the world outlook of the Marxist-Leninist party. It is called dialectical materialism because its approach to the phenomena of nature, its method of studying and apprehending them, is dialectical, while its interpretation of phenomena of nature, its conception of these phenomena, its theory, it is materialistic. And then he goes on to define historical materialism because Marx never really used the term dialectical materialism. He used the term dialectics and the term historical materialism, and Engels really used the term dialectical materialism a lot. That said, Marx used dialectics, but he always said that his method is historical materialism, so therefore, Stalin goes on to define what exactly is the difference. So, historical materialism is the extension of the principles of dialectical materialism to the study of social life, an application of these principles of dialectical materialism to the phenomena of the life of society, to the study of society and of its history. So how this is gonna go, I'm gonna try to explain what dialectical materialism is by explaining the three basic laws of dialectical materialism. And I will be reading mostly short quotes from various people so that you can see how they explained it, and then I'm gonna try to explain it using my own words. It is therefore from the history of nature and human society that the laws of dialectics are abstracted, for they are nothing but the most general laws of these two aspects of historical development as well as of thought itself, and indeed they can be reduced in the main to three: the law of transformation of quantity into quality and vice versa, the law of the interpenetration of opposites, the law of the negation of the negation. So that is what Engels says in Anti-Düring chapter 2. Those are the basic laws, but sometimes the order of is different, and sometimes the wording is slightly different. But basically, they are the transformation of quality into quantity, and vice versa, and then the unity of opposites or interpenetration of opposites, however you want to say that, and then the negation of the negation. Okay, so I'm gonna begin with the law of the unity and conflict of opposites, as it's sometimes called. In the previous quote, Engels called it the law of interpenetration of opposites, but usually nowadays we call it the unity of opposites. The short term law of the unity of opposites. You don't really have to usually say the conflict of opposites, so this is Lenin. Dialectics in the proper sense is the study of contradiction in the very essence of objects. The two basic, or two possible, or two historically observable conceptions of development, evolution, are development as decrease and increase, as repetition, and development as a unity of opposites, the division of unity into mutually exclusive opposites and their reciprocal relation. The unity, coincidence, identity, equal action of opposites is conditional, temporary, transitory, relative. The struggle of mutually exclusive opposites is absolute, just as development and motion are absolute. It is common knowledge that in any given society the strivings of some of its members conflict with the strivings of others, that social life is full of contradictions, and that history reveals a struggle between nations and societies, as well as within nations and societies, and besides an alternation of periods of revolution and reaction, peace and war, stagnation and rapid progress or decline. And then this is Stalin. Contrary to metaphysics, dialectics holds that internal contradictions are inherent in all things and phenomena of nature, for they all have their negative and positive sides, past and a future, something dying away and something developing, and that the struggle between these opposites, the struggle between the old and the new, between that which is dying away and that which is being born, between that which is disappearing and that which is developing, constitutes the internal content of the process of development. And then I'm gonna read you one more quote. This is from Mao, and then I'm gonna explain it to you myself. There is the unity of the two opposites of atomic nucleus and electrons. Inside the nucleus there are the opposites of neutrons and protons. Inside a proton there are protons and antiprotons, and inside a neutron there are neutrons and antineutrons. In a nutshell, the unities of opposites are endless. Basically what this law means is that in everything there are contradictory and mutually exclusive things, and these things are what causes development and change. If there was perfect balance in everything, then there would be no development. It would be stagnation and equilibrium, endless equilibrium. So it's the internal contradictions and opposing forces which create change and development. For example, the struggle between two opposing social classes, the working class and the capitalist class, this is a contradiction in the capitalist system, and the resolution of this contradiction is a revolution which leads to a new type of social system. So that is the conflict of these opposites. But what is the unity? Well, the unity is these mutually exclusive forces and these contradictory forces exist in the same thing, but they could not even exist without each other. So the workers and capitalists are in direct contradiction with each other, but without the workers, the capitalists could not exist. There literally is no way that capitalism could function without wage workers. And on the other hand, workers wouldn't be wage workers, they wouldn't be proletarians without capitalism, because the definition of a wage worker is, or a proletarian, is somebody who works for a capitalist. In socialism there aren't really proletarians, they are workers, but they're not proletarians. When they gain control of the society and therefore they gain control of the means of production, they are no longer proletarians, because proletarians are wage workers that don't have means of production. Therefore, the existence of both of these classes, both of these contradictory classes and forces, necessitates this kind of a contradictory system. So when the contradictory system of capitalism breaks down, both of these classes essentially cease to exist in their previous form. One aspect of this is also the tendency of these opposing forces to turn into one another, but that's another thing, and I'm gonna make another video on this where I explain some other things about dialectics, but I'm not gonna go into that here. So I hope that this gives you some kind of understanding what the unity of opposites means. Basically, there are opposite forces existing together, forming a unity which has these opposing contradictory forces, which neither of which could exist in that form without their unity. Then there is the law of the passage of quantitative changes into qualitative changes. So Engels says, quantity is transformed into quality and vice versa, as for example the fact that the cooperation of a number of people, the fusion of many forces into one single force, creates, to use Marx's phrase, a new power which is essentially different from the sum of its separate forces. And that's kind of goes back to what I said about reductionism, because as he says, you have cooperation of many people, 10 people working together, they can achieve much more than if you took 10 people working individually and then just added together what they have accomplished. So it's more than the sum of its separate forces, as he says. Then Engels again, we have a whole series of qualitatively different bodies formed by the simple quantitative addition of elements, and in fact always in the same proportion. This is most clearly evident in cases where the quantity of all elements of the compound changes in the same proportion. Thus, in the normal paraffins CnH2n plus 2, the lowest is methane, CH4, a gas, the highest known hexadecane, C16H34, is a solid body forming colorless crystals which melts at 21 degrees and boils only at 278 degrees. Each new member of both series comes into existence through the addition of CH2, one atom of carbon and two atoms of hydrogen, to the molecular formula of the preceding member, and this quantitative change in the molecular formula produces each time a qualitatively different body. So this is Engels again from during chapter 2. Chemistry can be termed the science of the qualitative changes of bodies as a result of changed quantitative composition. That was already known to Hegel himself, Logic, Collected Works, Volume 3, page 488. As in the case of oxygen, if 3 atoms unite into a molecule instead of the usual 2, we get ozone, a body which is considerably different from ordinary oxygen in its odor and reactions. Again, one can take the various proportions in which oxygen combines with nitrogen or sulfur, each of which produces a substance qualitatively different from any of the others. How different laughing gas nitrogen monoxide N2O is from nitric anhydride nitrogen pentoxide N2O5. First is a gas, the second at ordinary temperatures a solid crystalline substance, and yet the whole difference in composition is that the second contains 5 times as much oxygen as the first, and between the two of them are 3 more oxides of nitrogen, each of which is qualitatively different from the first 2 and from each other. The law of the transformation of quantity into quality and vice versa. For our purpose, we could express this by saying that in nature, in a manner exactly fixed for each individual case, qualitative change can only occur by the quantitative addition or subtraction of matter or motion, so-called energy. All qualitative differences in nature rest on differences of chemical composition or on different quantities or forms of motion, energy, or, as is almost always the case, on both. Hence, it is impossible to alter the quality of a body without addition or subtraction of matter or motion, i.e., without quantitative alteration of the body concerned. In this form, therefore, Hegel's mysterious principle appears not only quite rational, but even rather obvious. And one more quote, this is by Mao on contradiction. Metaphysicians hold that all the different kinds of things in the universe and all their characteristics have been the same ever since they first came into being. All subsequent changes have simply been increase or decrease in quantity. They contend that a thing can only keep on repeating itself as the same kind of thing and cannot change into anything different. So he's kind of going into the negation of the negation there, but I'll explain that in a moment. So the basic idea in the quantity changing into quality, usually people think about quantity becoming quality, although it can be the other way around as well. But what exactly does it mean? Well, Engels there gave many examples that simply by adding or removing doesn't always have to be an increase, but usually people think about it as, increase in quantity becoming changes in quality. But, as I said, it works both ways. So, for example, adding more protons and you get completely new chemical elements is a simple way of figuring what it means. Or adding more heat to an object, for example, water makes it boil and turns it from a liquid state to a gas. Or, for example, something that is in its solid state at, for example, room temperature can be heated, and once there's enough heat accumulated, it will turn into a liquid state or a gaseous state. So simply the quantitative addition of heat or energy, more precisely, is changes its qualities. And this works in social life as well. Revolution and a change from capitalism to socialism is a qualitative leap, qualitative change, which takes place when multiple things happen. For example, the classes, the workers, there's an increase in their revolutionary activity, and then once that has reached a certain level, it will overthrow the system and there will be a qualitative change. Now, of course, revolutions don't always work, but if a revolution fails, then that just means that the revolutionary activity hasn't accumulated enough. If you want to think about it in the dialectical terms like that, in a very simplified way, by the way. But that is what quantity into changing into quality means. And then I'm gonna finally deal with the law of the negation of the negation. And again, I'm gonna start by quoting somebody. I'm gonna quote Marx this time. It is the negation of the negation. This re-establishes individual property, but on the basis of acquisition of the capitalist era, i.e. on cooperation of free workers and their possession in common of the land, of the means of production produced by labor. The transformation of scattered private property arising from individual labor into capitalist private property is naturally a process incomparably more protracted, arduous and difficult than the transformation of capitalist private property, already practically resting on socialized production into socialized property. So he's talking there about the development of the productive forces, the primitive communism when the private property doesn't exist yet. For example, many indigenous tribes had no concept of private property. So when when individual private property arises, it eventually starts to slowly but surely centralize and concentrate, and it concentrates very, very rapidly after feudalism ends, and all the small peasant holdings are basically bought and taken over by large capitalists and large landlords, and then finally private property will be negated, because first there is primitive common ownership, which is negated by private property coming into existence, and then the private property itself is negated when these things that have been centralized by capitalism are then taken over by the society as a whole and become socialist property. The capitalist mode of production and appropriation, hence the capitalist private property, is the first negation of individual private property, founded on the labor of the proprietor. Capitalist production begets, with the inexorability of a process of nature, its own negation. It is the negation of the negation. And this is Engels. Inequality once more changes into equality, not however into former naive equality of the speechless primitive men, but into the higher equality of the social contract. The oppressors are oppressed. It is the negation of the negation. So here Engels is explaining the same thing, that first of all, we have the thing, inequality, changing into its opposite, equality. But as he says, this is another key aspect of the negation, that not only is it the first negation is negated. For example, primitive communism had equality, which is negated by the rise of private property, and then that in itself is negated again by the rise of modern socialism and communism. So there is the negation of the original negation, two negations. However, it doesn't simply go back to primitive communism, but it goes into something that is better and more highly developed. It goes into a modern communism, and that is a key aspect of the historical materialist worldview, and the key aspect of negation of the negation, that there is a development. It doesn't simply do a 360, it goes further than that. It doesn't go back to the old, it goes forward. And then this is a rather long quote, but it to me pretty clearly explains this concept using an example of nature. But what then is this fearful negation of the negation? A very simple process which is taking place everywhere and every day, which any child can understand as soon as it is stripped of the veil of mystery in which it was enveloped by the old idealist philosophy. Let us take a grain of barley. Billions of such grains of barley are milled, boiled and brewed, and then consumed. But if such a grain of barley meets with conditions which are normal for it, falls on suitable soil, then under the influence of heat and moisture it undergoes a specific change. It germinates. The grain as such ceases to exist, it is negated, and in its place appears the plant which has arisen from it, the negation of the grain. But what is the normal life process of this plant? It grows, flowers, is fertilized, and finally once more produces grains of barley. And as soon as these have ripened, the stalk dies, is in its turn negated. As a result of this negation of the negation, we have once again the original grain of barley, but not as a single unit, but 10, 20 or 30-fold. Species of grain change extremely slowly, and so the barley of today is almost the same as it was a century ago. But if we take a plastic ornamental plant, for example a dahlia or an orchid, and treat the seed and the plant which grows from it according to the gardener's art, we get as a result of this negation of the negation not only more seeds, but also qualitatively improved seeds, which produce more beautiful flowers, and each repetition of the process, each fresh negation of the negation, enhances this process of perfection. Yeah, I think that's a pretty good quote. He explains basically that each negation of the negation there is quantitative change, and as we know, once quantitative changes have accumulated enough, there will be a qualitative change. Now he goes on to explain in this chapter of anti-daring that, of course, in most cases it's way more complex than that, but that's only a simple, explanation, because he uses animals as well as examples, and he says that of course in most cases, like animals give birth to offspring multiple times during their life, and it's much more complex than this most of the time, but that's a very simple explanation of it. Yeah, so I hope that makes sense to you. I hope you can understand what that means, and I will make another video where I talk about a couple more things about the self-motion of things, the so-called self-motion, which is a very confusing term unless you know what it means, obviously, I guess. And I mean, most things are strange if you don't know what they are, but anyway. Then principal contradiction and the universality and particularity of contradiction and stuff that Mao said. Anyway, that's it, and I hope to see you in another video, and yeah, if you have any questions, please ask. I will try to answer, and if you think I'm wrong, please let me know, correct me. Okay, bye now.